Next up, I'm delighted to introduce Tom Standage. Now, anyone who listens to the Economist podcast, like me and particularly Babbage, will be a huge fan of his, I'm sure. He's deputy editor of the Economist, and which he joined in 1998, which I know is longer than many of you here have actually been alive. So it's great to have him with us today. He's held various positions there, including technology editor, business editor, digital editor, and science correspondent. He is the author of a number of different books, including New York Times bestsellers, A History of the World in 6 Glasses, and An Edible History of Humanity. His book is also for sale at the Daunt Bookshop, and he'll be doing a book signing afterwards. But I'm really delighted to have him with us today, and I'm honored to introduce him to the stage. Thank you very much, Tom.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. Good to hear The Economist being name-checked by the previous speaker, in fact, the EIU numbers on democracy and how depressing it is. Right, I imagine most people in this room are old enough to drive. Who in this room is old enough to drive? Okay, who is old enough to drive and has not learnt to drive? Yeah, right. Okay, so when I was 17, what was the first thing I did? I had a driving lesson and I qualified to drive as early as I possibly could, and that's the way things used to be. But not anymore, and that's what I want to talk about today. What I want to talk about is this. What's the world really going to look like when self-driving cars arrive? Probably not like this. But this is an idea that's been around for quite a long time. People have been thinking about it for quite a long time, but it's now getting close to reality. There are self-driving cars on the road in some parts of the world, and they work as long as it's sunny and all that sort of thing. So this is something that we are about to make real. So what's it going to look like? And much of the discussion today is about the technology and the safety of these vehicles. And that's very important, and it's obviously crucial that these are safe. But I think we are going to get them to work safely. I think that's going to happen. So for me, the question is, once we've figured out and we've deployed them, what does the world look like? And if you want to know what a driverless world is going to look like, I think you have to look not at the technology, but at the economics. And the economic and the political rules that we put around autonomous vehicles are going to be much more important in the long run than the details about how they work internally. So I think we need to start thinking about this now, because otherwise we risk making the same mistake that people made about 120 years ago when cars were first introduced. Now, today, people are very excited about the benefits that we're going to get from autonomous vehicles. So here's Mary Barra. She's the CEO of GM, America's biggest car maker, and she has committed the company to this goal of 0 accidents, 0 emissions, and 0 congestion through basically autonomous electric cars. And their electric car program, they bought this startup called Cruise, is very, very impressive. I mean, it's up there. They and Waymo, which is the Google self-driving car unit, are generally considered to be the market leaders here. So this is great. I think we could all get behind this. We'd all like there to be 0 accidents, 0 emission, and 0 congestion. However, I can't help but noticing this. This is from the journal The Horseless Age in November 1895, and it's celebrating the fact that with the arrival of automobiles, all the problems associated with horses are about to go away. Streets will be cleaner, less pollution. Jams and blockades less likely to occur. That means less traffic, and accidents less frequent. It sounds great. Now, some of you may have heard of I was reminded of this on the way here by my daughter, that some of you may have heard of the great horse manure crisis of 1894. Has anyone heard of that? In London and New York, people were very worried with the amount of horse manure that was piling up in the streets. This was a real environmental problem. And the Times of London supposedly predicted that by the 1940s, the horse manure would be up to kind of the second story of all of the buildings. And I have to say, when I started looking into the subject of self-driving cars, which I've been obsessed with for the last couple of years, I thought this story was, well, actually horse shit. But it turns out, if you go and look, it is true. There really were people worrying about this. And so this was a big concern. And people really did jump on cars in the 1890s because they thought they'd be much, much cleaner, and they thought they'd be safer. And of course, things didn't quite work out that way. Do we have these lovely... Oh, another thing it says here, which is quite funny, is that cities, here we are, in cities, the noise and clatter of the streets will be reduced. I mean, it's hilarious, isn't it? They honestly just thought everything would stay the same. You'd still have carriages, they'd just be horseless carriages, so you just wouldn't have the horses, but everything else would stay the same. And of course, this was completely wrong. We ended up rebuilding the world, literally, around the car, from motorways to shopping malls to commuter suburbs. So when people talk about the impact of autonomous cars today, I kind of go, I'm not sure we can necessarily assume it's going to turn out the way they're expecting. there's a whole load of questions that people ask about the driverless future. Will there be more traffic or less traffic? Will we need to own cars? Will there be less private ownership of cars? Will people use public transport less? Will there be more or less urban sprawl? And these are really interesting questions, and I think the answer doesn't depend on the technology, the answer depends on the economics, and specifically the pricing. So let's look at each of those in turn. Let's start with traffic. So traffic is bad, traffic wastes time and energy, and there are various more or less rubbish figures made up by people like McKinsey that will kind of try to put a number in trillions of dollars on the lost productivity associated with sitting in traffic, but it is essentially a problem. And if you can replace cars with driverless cars, what's going to happen? You can argue it both ways. On the one hand, you can say, well, driverless cars, they can do things that human-driven cars can't do. You can pack them closer together on roads. You can do things like have lanes of roads that work in one direction at some times of day, in another direction at another times of day. You can have them plan their routes more cleverly, et cetera, et cetera. You can have people using them in a shared way. So all of that means fewer vehicles on the road, less traffic. It'll be great. You can also argue it the other way round. You can say, well, AVs are going to be so awesome. Today, when you drive a car, if it's a privately owned car, it costs about $1.50 a mile if you take everything into account, how much you're paying for the car, insurance. I know most of you don't drive, but if you did drive cars, this is what you'd be looking at. If you take an Uber, that's about $2.50 a mile. And most of that cost actually is the cost of the human driver. So the reason Uber and everybody else is trying to build these autonomous cars is that theoretically, you take the driver out, you could get the cost per mile for an autonomous vehicle down to about 70 or 80 cents per mile. So that's much cheaper. It's cheaper than owning a car, which means people might not want to own cars. But it also means that the cost of going somewhere is going to fall, which means more people are going to want to do it. And some people think that the latent demand that this will unlock could be as much as 6 or 7 times more than the amount of demand there is for going in cars at the moment. So you might just get kind of gridlock and traffic. It'll just be autonomous gridlock and autonomous traffic. So which is it? Well, it depends on the pricing. I think it's very likely that cities are going to impose a smart form of congestion charging on AVs, a bit like the surge pricing in Uber, or a bit like the kind of congestion charging we have in London, only not as crap. If you look at the congestion charging we have in London, we have one zone, and during the week, if you want to drive in that zone, you have to pay £11.50, and it's like a ticket to drive in that zone as much as you like. It's a very, very crude system. There are other congestion charging schemes in other parts of the world that are a bit smarter. They adjust the pricing depending on how much traffic there is. If there's more traffic, they put the price up, discourage people from making journeys at the margin. There are other systems that charge you different amounts for different bits of the city. So there's all sorts of smart things you can do. And by definition, autonomous vehicles are going to have to know exactly where they are at all times. Otherwise, they're going to crash into things. So you could have a system where you say, we're going to have a sort of per mile charge, and we're going to vary it depending on the vehicle type. So you might charge delivery vehicles different from taxis. How many people are in the vehicle? You could vary it based on that. Time of day, level of congestion. And so you'd have a much, much smarter congestion charging system. And this is a logical conclusion of the kind of systems that cities are doing now. It's just they can't actually impose them. It's too difficult. But you'd be able to impose this, if you had an autonomous fleet, much more easily. So what that would mean is we would have the ability to vary how much traffic there was. We could put the price up when there was more traffic, and people would not take journeys unless it was really important. We see this already with Uber. This is why Uber has surge pricing. So cities will be able to control how much traffic there is using dynamic road pricing. So you can't answer the question of whether AVs lead to more or less traffic. It really all depends on the pricing, and AVs allow you to set those prices. What about owning private cars? So this is Cedric. This is a Renault autonomous vehicle. This is the kind of thing that an autonomous vehicle will probably look like. It won't just look like a car with no driver in it. It makes sense to make them sort of shared vehicles, probably 4 to 8 people in them, and this is one of the sort of plausible designs for these little pods. So as we saw with the pricing data, owning a car is going to be more expensive if you live in a part of a city where there's a robo-taxi service, where you can just call a car like you do with Uber and get into it and it'll drop you off at the other end. So that's going to probably put people off owning cars if there is this sort of service available instead. Now, there's some quite amazing, no one really knows, but there are all sorts of predictions about how much this is going to reduce car ownership. And this is a bunch of figures from UBS. They reckon that private car ownership will fall by something like 50% overall, about 70% in cities. But no one really knows. So what's going to happen? Well, guess what? It depends on the pricing, doesn't it? There are various ways that you can make owning a car more or less attractive. At the moment, you can obviously you have to buy road tax discs and things. They don't cost very much, so they're not going to put anyone off actually buying a car. If you go somewhere like Singapore, you have to buy a license in an auction to own a car, and it costs something ridiculous, like $50,000. And then you have 100% import tax on all cars. So you have people driving around in kind of $100,000 Fiat Pandas, basically. But having a car is a great status symbol because it shows you could afford to buy the license, but it's stupid. And so what Singapore is doing is it said it's not going to allow any more private cars onto the road than there are today. It's going to keep the number of licenses fixed. And this is because they've got a fixed amount of land in Singapore. They don't want more cars competing for the same amount of space. So this is the kind of thing I think we're going to see more of. Another thing you can do is you can price parking, obviously. We can do that now. You can also have something called a zombie tax. So a zombie tax is the idea that you charge an empty autonomous vehicle for being on the road at all. And this encourages operators of those vehicles not to operate empty vehicles. So that's a way that you can... as a way you can control, when we're going back to here, the amount of traffic there is, because you can get them to take vehicles off the road, but it's also a way you can make private ownership less attractive. One of the things people worry about is if I own my own self-driving car, and I have it take me to work in the morning, and then it hasn't got anywhere to park, so it just drives around all day, and then it picks me up at the end of the day and takes me home. That's terrible, because that's a waste of space, a waste of energy, and so on. The zombie tax would possibly discourage some of that. So the degree to which car ownership will fall, which is a subject of much speculation, will depend on pricing again. What happens to our streets, and what happens to public transport, and transport equity. So one of the things about cars, and one of the reasons they were seized upon, is that they do allow you to go to places where there isn't public transport, and they do make it possible for people to work far away from where they live, and so on and so on. So they do increase freedom in some ways, even though they reduce it in others. So what happens with AVs? Well, there was a study that came out this week that looked at the city of Boston, and it concluded that if you put robo-taxis on the streets of Boston, which is one of the places they're getting tested, it would it would increase the traffic by 6% because people would stop using public transport and use robo-taxis instead. And again, this makes all kinds of assumptions about pricing. But if you look at cities, a bunch of city-level studies have been done that look at the impact of Uber. And Uber and Lyft do seem, at the margin, to take people off public transport, mostly off buses, funnily enough, buses and light rail. So if you deploy all these things, aren't you going to get people using less public transport? Isn't that going to be bad? Well, guess what it depends on? The pricing. But also it depends on something else, which is that we kind of assume that we're thinking about these AVs as if they're private cars. Actually, what you're going to get is some cities are going to buy fleets and operate them as public transport. So the city of Seattle, I'm sure, will do it, and the city of Singapore will do it. They will make autonomous vehicles part of their transport infrastructure. And then what you can do is you can adjust the pricing in various ways to get the kind of usage of public transport that is most efficient. So there have been experiments in some American cities using ride-hailing, Uber and Lyft, for last mile. That's to take people to and from the nearest rail station or bus stop to them, usually rail stations. So that way you can encourage people to use public transport by subsidizing that last mile. Another thing you could do is you could encourage the use of robo-taxis in sparsely populated suburbs where it's not practical to build public transport. Building light rail and things like that is very expensive. So you could provide public transport in those areas, essentially by subsidizing ride-hailing and robo-taxis within those particular neighborhoods. So that encourages the use of public transport by getting more people into AVs, because AVs are a kind of public transport. And we're already seeing other examples of this too. There's a service called Uber Express Pool, and it's kind of like Uber Pool, except it runs along main roads, because Ubers spend a lot of their time going into small side streets, trying to find people, and then coming out of them again. And if you just keep them on the main roads, and you say to people, look, you can have a discount if you walk to this 2 blocks away to this main road, it's much quicker for everyone. And we're also seeing multimodal ticketing. So the CEO of Uber has talked about being able to say, I want to go from here to here, and being able to buy everything through the Uber app. So a car picks you up, it maybe takes you to a station, then maybe you get on a train, but the ticket's all been taken care of. And when you get out the other end, there's another Uber waiting to take you to your destination. So he sees Uber as a sort of end-to-end transport company. And if you do that, is that increasing public transport? Yeah, it is, but it's also using ride-hailing for the first and the last mile. So I think the current perception that cars are the enemy of public transport is going to have to change, and the extent to which people use public transport will depend on pricing. What happens to the shape of our cities? Suburbs. Will there be more sprawl or less? One of the obvious things that happen with cars is that we got the rise of commuter suburbs. And urban planners hate sprawl and hate suburbs. It's very, very funny. They all go to conferences and they all talk about how great it would be if all cities were denser and everyone could walk everywhere. Meanwhile, in the real world, people actually like living in suburbs because they get more space. And they don't all look as beautiful as this suburb, but you know, it is more pleasant for many people to live in a suburb, especially if you've got kids. So what's going to happen with autonomous vehicles? Well, again, you can argue it both ways. You can say, well, if you get rid of the need for parking, which is a big chunk of the land area in a lot of cities, 24% of the area of LA is parking, then you free up a whole load of city centre space, which you can use for housing, and then you can have, you know, a denser city. And everyone can just not own cars and take AVs in the centre, and it'll be great, and we'll get this densification of cities. But you can also argue it the other way round. You can say, well, if you can sleep or work in your car on the way to work, you can afford to have a much longer commute, and therefore you can live further out. And so you might want to live not just in a suburb, but you might want to live in an exurb, which is a sort of, you know, a town outside of a big city. So which one will it be? Well, guess what? It'll all depend on pricing. That's right. So we might see some cities that have a particular policy of wanting more or less sprawl or wanting to preserve a green belt. They might either subsidize or penalize long-distance commuters. I think another thing we'll see is, at the moment, companies have to provide parking for their employees, particularly in America, there's a big problem. So they might decide that rather than paying for building parking lots, they will just give their employees automatic, you know, autonomous vehicle transport to and from the office. That would be possibly cheaper than providing parking, but then they wouldn't have to waste space on parking. So there's going to be a whole load of variables that determine, you know, whether they make that call or not, and one of them will be what's the price, and does it, you know, is the city where they're operating encouraging or discouraging long-distance commuting? And I think we'll get some answers in some cities and other answers in other cities. Okay, now in a way this is all kind of obvious, right? Economics, everything depends on pricing. Set the price high and people will do less, and set the price low and they'll do more of it. Duh. But if you look back at what happened with cars and why they kind of took us by surprise, and we got unexpected levels of pollution and traffic, and we got less use of public transport, and we got more sprawl. Why did all of those things happen? Well, they all happened because the externalities associated with using cars were never properly priced in. Cars are massively subsidized. Car users are massively subsidized in lots of ways. You know, the amount that the government collects in road tax is not enough to maintain the roads. So there is this cross-subsidy from non-car drivers to drivers, and so on and so on. But the great thing is, with autonomous vehicles, you could actually price in the externalities. So this is absolutely, if you're an economist or an urban planner, they're all jumping up and down with glee, because finally, they can price things in that they haven't been able to price in before. And then they can sort of try and get people to make more rational choices about things. So this all sounds great, but there is a dark side to all of this, because the same tolling schemes that will allow city planners to minimize congestion or subsidize robo-taxi services in underserved areas, which are sometimes called transport deserts, the same schemes have a darker side to which I think too little attention is being paid. Autonomous vehicles will provide an extraordinarily subtle policy tool, which can, in theory, be used to transform cities. But in the hands of an authoritarian government, it could also become a very powerful means of social control. AVs will know, autonomous vehicles will know where everyone is and where everyone has ever been. Our phones already do, right? But if AVs are the main form of transport, authoritarian governments could start deciding who gets to go where, opening the ways to new forms of segregation and discrimination. In authoritarian countries, robotaxis might not liberate, well, they might liberate people from cars on the one hand, but they could also restrict people's movements in other ways. Now, if this sounds implausible, recall that Robert Moses, who was an urban planner in America, in New York, in the 20th century, he notoriously designed the Southern State Parkway, which links New York City to the beaches of Long Island, with low bridges. And this was to favor access by rich white people in cars while discriminating against poor black people in buses. So we have had examples of this even in the developed world. But the really scary aspect of this is what China is doing with its social credit system. And this is a system that gives everyone basically a score for how good a citizen they are, based on things like what they write on social media, whether they visit their parents often enough, and so on. And if you get a bad score, it can start to make things go bad for you. You won't be able to get a loan. You might not be allowed to travel on trains or planes internally within China. And then if you look at what China's doing in the western province of Xinjiang, it's basically turning it into a massive concentration camp for the Muslim Uyghur minority there. And you can very easily imagine if there are only certain forms of transport and the government can control them all, they can say, right, you lot, you're all staying there. So this is kind of worrying. We might actually need, and I've talked to people who have suggested this, we might need a sort of net neutrality for roads to ensure that all vehicles and all people are free to go everywhere. Otherwise, you might have some neighborhoods saying, well, we don't want these sorts of people, or we don't want those sorts of cars, and only these sorts of people are allowed to use that car network, so we'll ban this car network and we'll allow that car network. That could all be a bit worrying. So I think we need to think about these things now. In summary, there's a wide range of possible autonomous vehicle futures. And what I've tried to argue is that economic and political choices will determine which future we get. The technology itself does not imply a particular outcome. At the moment, we're all fixating on the technology and the safety, which is fair enough, which is what we did in the 1890s as well. At the time, again, every time there was a person killed by a car, it was front page news, and everyone was saying, well, do we really want to do this? And other people were saying, oh, it'll be great, there'll be less traffic, and it'll be less pollution, and so on. So I think we need to look past the current debate about safety and technology and think about these much longer term things. And in the coming years, we're starting to see this already, we're going to see a lot of experimentation around pricing and regulatory models for autonomous vehicles in different parts of the world. We're going to see different pricing schemes, debates about whether to ban private vehicles in some neighborhoods, in city centers. That all sounds harmless enough, but collectively, all of these choices add up to essentially control over who can go where and when, which is an inescapably political question. So as we see the results of these experiments in different parts of the world, it will be up to us to choose and to advocate for and to campaign for and to vote for the particular kind of autonomous future that we want. Autonomous vehicles don't have steering wheels, but we can use careful pricing as a way to steer them as a society to where we want them to go. Thanks for listening.